Mr. Hill, what has television given you?
Well, nervous dyspepsia, indigestion, heartburn, all sorts of things like that, you know.
For more than 3 decades, one man's grin, one saxophone riff, and one endless chase across a park somewhere in England defined an entire style of British comedy. Millions tuned in every week to watch a portly, mischievous performer chase scantily dressed women around fountains and hedges, while a jaunty tune played underneath. It was silly. It was harmless. Or so it seemed. And then, almost overnight, it was gone. The man who had once been one of the most recognized comedians on the planet found his own television network quietly closing the door on him. And the show that had entertained a generation was left off the air for good. What actually happened behind the scenes? Was there really one single sketch that tipped the balance? Or was the truth far messier than a single moment of bad judgment? To understand how a comedy phenomenon crumbled, we first need to understand a man who built it. Alfred Hawthorne Hill was born in Southampton, England, in January of 1924, though even that detail has never been pinned down with total certainty, since some records point to 1925 instead. It is a fitting bit of confusion for a man whose entire career would later be defined by mixing fact, fiction, and exaggeration into something audiences couldn't get enough of. His household wasn't an obvious breeding ground for a future television star. His father ran a shop that sold surgical equipment, a steady and unglamorous trade. But look one generation further back, and the picture changes. Alfred's grandfather spent his working life as a circus clown, and it's tempting to imagine that some of that performer's instinct skipped a generation and landed squarely on young Alfred. School didn't point him toward comedy either. After finishing his education locally, he drifted through a string of ordinary jobs that had nothing to do with show business. He stocked shelves, delivered milk, drove trucks, worked a bridge crossing, and even played drums for a while. None of it was glamorous, but all of it gave him something valuable, a front-row seat to ordinary working-class British life, the exact material he would later mine for characters and gags. A milkman, a bumbling office clerk, a lecherous shopkeeper. These weren't inventions plucked from nowhere. They were people he had actually stood next to. His first real taste of performance came when he landed a job as an assistant stage manager for a touring variety show. It wasn't a starring role by any stretch, but it put him inside the machinery of live entertainment, and that experience of timing, structure, and stagecraft would echo throughout his later work. Then the Second World War interrupted everything. Called up in 1942, Hill trained as a mechanic within the corps responsible for keeping British military vehicles and equipment running. He later served as a truck driver and searchlight operator, and by September 1944, he found himself in Normandy, in the middle of one of the defining campaigns of the entire war. It's a striking contrast. The man who would later be famous for slapstick and double entendre spent his early 20s surrounded by the very real chaos of a continent at war. Before his service ended, Hill was transferred into a unit dedicated to entertaining Allied troops, staging performances to keep morale high in the darkest circumstances imaginable. It was here, entertaining exhausted soldiers who badly needed a laugh, that he really discovered his gift. He learned how to read a room, how to land a joke under pressure, and how comedy could function as something close to public service. He drew inspiration from the music hall tradition, the boisterous variety entertainment that had dominated British stages for decades before television existed, full of song, dance, magic, and larger-than-life comic performers. And it was in tribute to one of his idols, the American comedian Jack Benny, that Alfred Hawthorne Hill began performing under a new name. Benny Hill was born. Radio, not television, gave Hill his first real break. In the autumn of 1947, he appeared on a well-known variety radio program, and his sense of timing quickly caught the attention of listeners. Within a few years, he had made the leap to television, appearing on screen for the first time around 1950, just as the medium itself was becoming a fixture in British homes. Television gave him something radio never could, a visual stage. Suddenly, his physical comedy, his exaggerated facial expressions, and his knack for sight gags had somewhere to live. Over the following decade, he built a career piece by piece, starring in an anthology series where he played a different character every week, proving he wasn't a one-trick performer, but something closer to a comedic chameleon. He even stretched himself into serious territory, taking on a Shakespearean role in a television adaptation of one of the Bard's most famous comedies, a move that surprised critics who had pegged him as pure slapstick. He kept working across mediums, returning to radio in the mid-1960s with a satirical program that poked fun at current events and pop culture, spoofing everything from spy films to the biggest music acts of the day. Recurring characters started to take shape, personas that audiences began to recognize and love, each one a small piece of the larger comic universe he was quietly assembling. None of it came easily. Reviews were mixed. Stage performances, in particular, didn't always land the way he hoped. But that grinding, uneven early period is exactly what sharpened him. By the time television truly became his home, he had already spent years learning what worked and, just as importantly, what didn't. In January of 1955, The Benny Hill Show premiered, and British comedy would never quite look the same again. From the very beginning, it drew heavily on the spirit of music hall entertainment, blending live sketch comedy with pre-recorded segments in a way that gave Hill enormous creative freedom. Slapstick, wordplay, parody, and visual gags became the show's signature blend, and audiences responded immediately. Hill didn't build this world alone. A rotating group of performers and writers helped shape the material over the years, and one figure in particular became inseparable from the show's comic identity, a small, bald character actor who became the frequent, good-natured victim of Hill's exaggerated head-slapping routine. His deadpan reactions turned him into a beloved fixture, proof that Hill understood the value of a perfect comic foil. For over a decade, the show lived primarily on the BBC, with occasional detours to other networks along the way. Then, in 1969, everything changed. The show moved to a new network and shifted format, trading a weekly schedule for a series of hour-long specials. That change gave Hill more room to build elaborate sketches and musical numbers, and the results paid off enormously. The show's popularity soared, eventually reaching broadcast deals in well over 100 countries. Physical comedy, it turned out, didn't need translation. A pratfall lands the same in any language. By the following decade, the show had become something close to a cultural institution, with viewer numbers climbing into the tens of millions during its peak years in the early 1970s. Awards followed, including recognition for Hill's writing, and international acclaim soon opened doors in the United States, where the show found a devoted syndicated audience and earned nominations for major American television honors. One element became inseparable from the show's identity: the closing chase sequence. Nearly every episode ended with Hill and a cast of oddball characters sprinting through parks and streets in a frenzy of exaggerated motion, filmed using an old technique where footage shot at a slower frame rate is played back at normal speed, creating that unmistakable speeded-up, cartoonish look. Set to a jaunty saxophone instrumental, the sequence became so tightly associated with Hill's comedy that the tune itself eventually became known by his name. Decades later, that same piece of music would be voted one of the greatest television themes of all time, a small but telling sign of just how deeply it had lodged itself in the public imagination. As the show moved into the 1980s, it evolved again. A troupe of dancers joined the cast, adding glamour and choreography to the sketches, while also becoming one of the most talked-about elements of the entire program. Some of these performers went on to notable careers of their own, including one dancer who later found international fame on an American sitcom, playing an entirely different kind of character. Alongside the dancers, a loyal ensemble of supporting actors kept the show grounded, providing the straight-laced counterbalance that Hill's larger-than-life characters needed to work. By any measure, The Benny Hill Show had become one of the most recognizable British comedy exports in the world. And that is precisely what makes its ending so jarring. It's easy, looking back, to picture Benny Hill as simply the man mugging for the camera, but the truth is he was one of the busiest working comedy writers in British television for decades. He wrote or co-wrote an enormous portion of his own material, a rarity among performers of his stature, and he approached the job with the discipline of someone who never fully trusted anyone else to understand his comic rhythms as well as he did. That said, he wasn't above bringing in outside ideas when they were good enough, and the credit for those contributions wasn't always handled the way it would be today. One well-known example involves a cast member who reportedly sold Hill a sketch concept in the mid-1970s, an idea about an oversized, comically exaggerated character that later made his way into a broadcast episode, all without any on-screen acknowledgement of where it had actually come from. Hill did, by some accounts, write to thank her personally and let her know the idea would be used. A small gesture that speaks to a working relationship built more on old-fashioned informality than on the kind of contractual credit systems that would eventually become standard in the industry. That kind of quiet, behind-the-scenes give and take was fairly typical of how variety television operated in that era. Writers' rooms, as we understand them today, didn't really exist in the same form. Instead, you had a tight circle of trusted collaborators, some credited, some not, feeding ideas into a single dominant creative voice who shaped everything into a consistent final product. For Hill, that meant the show always felt unmistakably like his, even when the raw material occasionally came from somewhere else. The ensemble around him mattered just as much as the writing. A handful of performers became almost as recognizable as Hill himself simply by being featured so consistently across so many years of sketches. There was a small, bald, straight man forever on the receiving end of exaggerated slaps, whose stoic reactions became a running joke in their own right. There were the various authority figures Hill loved to undercut, playing on the age-old comic tradition of puncturing pompous officials and self-important bureaucrats. And there was a rotating cast of women, some dancers, some actresses, some singers, who became inseparable from the show's visual identity, for better and for worse depending on who you ask. Success like that doesn't stay uncontested forever, and by the 1980s, the ground beneath Hill's brand of comedy had genuinely begun to shift. British comedy itself was going through an upheaval. A new generation of performers, often labeled alternative comedians, was rejecting the older variety tradition entirely, pushing instead for material that was more political, more pointed, and far less reliant on the kind of leering, girl-chasing gags that had defined Hill's decades of success. Among the loudest and most influential voices in that new wave was a comedian named Ben Elton. Sharp-tongued and unapologetically political, Elton became one of the public faces of alternative comedy, and he didn't hold back when it came to Hill. In a widely circulated magazine piece and later on a popular television broadcast, Elton went further than simply saying Hill's material was old-fashioned. He argued that the show's repeated imagery of women being chased, ogled, and objectified wasn't just outdated. It was genuinely harmful, suggesting that this kind of comedy helped normalize the mistreatment of women in real life. That was a serious accusation, and it landed at exactly the moment British culture was already re-examining how women were depicted across entertainment more broadly. Elton's criticism gave language and momentum to something that had been quietly building for years, a growing discomfort with formula that, decades earlier, had seemed like harmless cheekiness, but now read very differently to a changing audience. The response was immediate and split right down the middle. Some agreed wholeheartedly, arguing that comedy carries real cultural weight, and that Hill's brand of humor had simply failed to evolve with the times. Others pushed back hard, accusing Elton of overreach. One newspaper columnist memorably compared the pile-on to watching an elderly relative get roughed up by younger, more aggressive critics, arguing that whatever its flaws, the show didn't deserve to be treated as some kind of engine of real-world harm. Another magazine mocked the very idea that a comedy sketch show could be meaningfully blamed for broader social problems, comparing it to blaming classical musicians for unrelated environmental crimes happening on another continent entirely. It was a debate about comedy, but really it was a debate about how much responsibility entertainment bears for shaping the world around it, and that argument hasn't fully gone away even today. Even broadcasting regulators weighed in publicly, acknowledging that attitudes toward this kind of humor really had shifted. What once read as playful mischief, they suggested, now read to many viewers as simply outdated at best and offensive at worst. Interestingly, Elton himself later leaned into the absurdity of his own reputation, appearing in a sketch on a popular comedy series as an exaggerated caricature of a humorless, overly righteous version of himself, chased through the same kind of frantic scene he had once condemned, set to that same instantly recognizable saxophone tune. It was a strange, almost affectionate acknowledgement that the debate had become bigger than either side probably intended. Against that backdrop of mounting cultural tension, one particular sketch from the late 1980s came to be remembered as the moment the argument stopped being theoretical. The scene, structured as a parody of a beauty pageant, put a lineup of women on display to be evaluated and ogled in exactly the exaggerated, leering style the show had built its reputation on for decades. To longtime fans, It probably felt like business as usual. Another variation on a joke format the show had used 100 times before. But to critics, and increasingly to network executives who were watching public opinion shift in real time, it read as exactly the kind of material Elton and others have been warning about. An example served up almost too perfectly to prove their point. It's worth being honest about something here. No single sketch, however uncomfortable, single-handedly ends a television institution that had survived for over 3 decades. What that particular scene really did was crystallize a broader argument that had already been simmering for years, giving critics a concrete example to point to rather than a vague sense that the show had grown out of step with the culture. It became shorthand, a symbol standing in for a much larger and more complicated set of grievances. The introduction of a permanent dance troupe in the early 1980s marked a real turning point in how the show looked and how it was perceived. Where earlier decades of the program had leaned more heavily on Hill's writing and his gift for character work, this new era leaned harder into visual spectacle, choreographed numbers, and a parade of attractive young performers who were as central to the show's marketing as Hill himself. For a certain segment of the audience, this was exactly what kept the show fresh and exciting as it entered its 3rd decade on air. For critics, it was Exhibit A in the case that the show had drifted from clever character comedy into something closer to a leering spectacle dressed up as variety entertainment. It's worth remembering that several performers who came up through the system went on to have entirely respectable, celebrated careers afterward, including at least one who became a household name on American television, playing a completely different kind of role years later. That's a detail that complicates the simplest version of the story, the one where the show is remembered purely as exploitative. For many of the women involved, the experience was a genuine launching pad, a paid, visible platform in an industry that didn't offer many of those to young performers at the time. Whether that fact excuses or merely complicates the criticism aimed at the show's content is very much a matter of perspective, and it's a debate people still have. Meanwhile, British television as a whole was changing shape around Hill, whether he adapted or not. New channels, new formats, and an entirely new philosophy of comedy writing were reshaping what audiences, especially younger audiences, expected from a night of televised comedy. Shows built on sharp political commentary, absurdist logic, or character-driven awkwardness were pulling viewers, particularly younger ones, in a completely different direction than the broad, physical, innuendo-heavy style Hill had spent 30 years perfecting. It wasn't that his formula had stopped working entirely. Viewership abroad remained strong for years. But at home in Britain, the cultural center of gravity had genuinely shifted, and shows that once felt like the mainstream increasingly felt like a holdover from an earlier decade. If you ask what actually